Over the past several weeks, a small Caribbean nation, Trinidad and Tobago, has announced that it will begin 5 days of joint military exercises with the United States starting tomorrow. The islands lie just off the northeastern coast of Venezuela, making the drills immediately significant given the broader regional tensions. In parallel, Washington has deployed a major naval buildup in the Caribbean, including its newest and largest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford Strike Group, US. Officials say the deployment aims to disrupt drug trafficking in the region. At the same time, Venezuelan officials and regional observers interpret these moves as part of a potential escalation toward direct action involving Venezuela. On board Air Force One on Friday, US President Donald Trump was asked if he had made a decision about unilateral action in Venezuela. He responded, "I first. Don't have a minute, but I can't tell you what it would be." But the incomplete response captured attention, raising questions if Washington is weighing something significant. CNN's correspondent in Caracas reported that Venezuela appears to be bracing for something. He said, "It feels like that. That is yet another step. We've seen the tide come in, the tide coming every week." Given that the joint drills with Trinidad and Tobago can place US forces just 20 miles by boat across the water to Venezuelan territory, it has heightened the sense that Washington may be preparing for a more consequential move. Venezuelan President Maduro has sought to present himself publicly as a negotiator for peace, even while his government remains under substantial internal and external pressure after more than a decade in power. At a recent televised address, he told the American people, "Stop the insane hand of those who ordered bombing, killing and bringing the war to South America, to the Caribbean. America, stop the war." While mobilizations in Caracas and eastern shantytown districts may not be massive, the ruling regime still retains the capacity to rally thousands of supporters. Analysts note they interpret the visible street activity as an attempt to solidify the government's base ahead of any further escalation. Meanwhile, relations between Washington and its longtime ally, the United Kingdom, have been strained by the US campaign of strikes on boats in the Caribbean. British officials reportedly halted some intelligence sharing with the US over concerns the operations may violate international law. That move, some observers argue, signals a serious rupture in what is being considered a special relationship. One former Southern Command commander told analysts, "This is a very big deal. We never had the Brits say to us, 'We're not going to share information with you anymore.'" And the broader question arises, given the buildup of US naval power in the Caribbean, how will this not end up pulling the United States into a war? In Miami, a member of Congress representing the area commented, "I like being protected from all these drug boats coming into Miami." When asked how the boats were identified as drug trafficking vessels, he replied, "Well, I'm sure intel tells them that." But a former Coast Guard lawyer cautioned, "This is not warfare. This is not a battlefield. You go arrest that person. Those boats are very easy to intercept." He warned that destroying vessels at sea rather than conducting lawful interdictions sets a bad precedent. The debate has shifted to regime change in Venezuela. Some senior policymakers in Washington privately acknowledge they want President Maduro to step down. One US senator was quoted, "I think that's likely what he wants to see happen." And yet, as the US campaigns against Venezuela's government and alleged drug trafficking links, others caution that forcing a regime out destabilizes the region and may violate international norms. A senior analyst reflected, "I love the whole notion that we're just saying we're going to impose democracy there. It generally doesn't work, and that's not legal, and that's not the way we're supposed to." Another senior defense policy figure added, "People are going to go to prison for doing this. You can't just go kill people that don't represent an imminent threat to you." And he raised a pointed question. If you really do want Maduro to go, is that what you're doing with these strikes? You are destroying all of the evidence connecting Maduro to pushing drugs into the United States. Venezuela's presidency. Nicolás Maduro has been president of Venezuela since April 2013. He was sworn into a third term on 10 January 2025, following the contested July 2024 election. which many international observers concluded was not free or fair. His government remains under widespread international sanctions and domestic pressure, yet he continues to hold power. US military buildup and naval operations. Since August 2025, the US has deployed a substantial naval and marine presence in the southern Caribbean. This includes the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group and supporting vessels, as well as intelligence and air assets. In September, the US announced lethal strikes on vessels allegedly smuggling drugs, characterizing the campaign as a non-international armed conflict against so-called unlawful combatants, drug traffickers. The Pentagon, for its part, says the mission is to disrupt narcotics trafficking and dismantle criminal networks. However, legal experts argue the strikes may violate international law and maritime norms, especially given their possible extension to Venezuelan territory. Trinidad and Tobago U.S. drills. The U.S. Embassy in Port of Spain announced that U.S. Marines and the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force would conduct joint training from 1621 November 2025. President Maduro has denounced the move as irresponsible and a provocation, saying it threatens Venezuela's sovereignty. Intelligence sharing rift between US and UK. Reports indicate the United Kingdom has paused certain intelligence sharing with the US related to drug trafficking vessels in the Caribbean due to concerns that US strikes are unlawful. US officials deny an outright cutoff, but the episode marks a notable strain in transatlantic security cooperation. The Caribbean pathway offers one of the shorter maritime routes between South America and US shores. The proximity of Trinidad and Tobago to Venezuela means drills there carry direct strategic symbolism. The recent fielding of the USS Gerald R. Ford and other vessels underscores that Washington is flexing naval muscle close to Venezuelan waters. In Caracas, Maduro's rhetoric has emphasized national sovereignty and resistance. He has warned that any U.S. military intervention would trigger a widespread mobilization of militia forces. Analysts assess that Venezuela's armed forces are under stress. Aging platforms, budget constraints and internal corruption have eroded readiness. On the U.S. side, lawmakers and policymakers who favor hardline action point to Venezuela's alleged role in the regional drug trade, human rights abuses and alliance with adversary states. The Trump administration has repeatedly labeled the Venezuelan regime as a narco-state and has expanded sanctions while raising its reward for Maduro's capture. But critics warn that shifting from maritime interdictions to strikes on or near sovereign territory carries grave legal and diplomatic risks. They note that exercises or deployments near another state's coast border on coercion and that the use of force may violate international law if not justified by imminent self-defense or UN authorization. The coming days and weeks will be watched closely in Washington, Caracas, and across the region. The launch of joint drills between Trinidad and Tobago and the US, the continued naval buildup, and the record of lethal strikes on vessels create a volatile mix. The key questions now include: will the US decide to strike land-based targets inside Venezuela or open a new front? While Washington publicly denies regime change as the objective, some analysts believe pressure on Maduro is a strategic aim. How will Venezuela respond if the US crosses into its territorial waters or strikes closer to its coast? Caracas has signaled that it is willing to field militia and treat the drills as aggression. What will be the reaction of regional states and allies such as the UK, which appears increasingly sceptical of US actions in the Caribbean? The breakdown in intelligence sharing raises the possibility of wider diplomatic fallout. How will the domestic politics in both nations play out? In Venezuela, opposition groups remain fractured and repressed, while Maduro's regime maintains control through stateside mechanisms. In the US, lawmakers from Florida and elsewhere cite drug trafficking threats, but some legal advisors caution that precedent-setting strikes risk US obligations under law. In short, a modest Caribbean military exercise may, in fact, reflect a much larger strategic shift. The US appears to be moving from interdiction of illicit maritime traffic toward a broader posture of force projection near Venezuela. Venezuela, for its part, is responding with threats of resistance and a narrative of sovereignty under attack. Third-party allies, including the UK, are raising legal concerns. The region faces a moment of heightened risk and uncertainty where every manoeuvre carries the potential to trigger a dramatic shift. As one senior US defense policy source warned, you can't just go kill people that don't represent an imminent threat to you. That's scary. It sets a bad precedent. And as Venezuela's leader sternly addressed the United States, America, stop the war.